On the Hawaiian island of Oahu, Sunday, December 7, 1941, dawned with the promise of paradise. The air was warm, scented with the sweet perfume of hibiscus and plumeria, carrying the faint, ever-present salt of the Pacific. In the naval anchorage of Pearl Harbor, the steel backbone of American power in the Pacific lay sleeping, its great battleships moored in a neat, placid row off the coast of Ford Island. This was the bastion, the fortress that guaranteed the safety of a continent, and on this morning it was utterly serene. For the thousands of sailors, soldiers, and airmen stationed there, it was a day of cherished rest. In a world consumed by war, Hawaii was a protected haven, a coveted posting far from the grim realities of the conflicts raging in Europe and Asia. Sundays were for the slow, familiar rhythms of peacetime garrison duty. On the decks of the USS Arizona, the ship's band, renowned as one of the best in the Navy, began assembling their instruments for the daily 8 a.m. flag-raising ceremony, a ritual of patriotic music under a peaceful sky. In the mess halls of the USS Oklahoma and USS West Virginia sailors, many of them young men barely out of their teens lined up for breakfast, their conversations filled with easy complaints about the food and plans for a day of liberty in Honolulu. For many, the night before had been spent enjoying the music and nightlife of the city, and the morning was a slow, hazy recovery. Across the island, the civilian community was waking to its own quiet Sunday. In Honolulu, families were getting ready for church, dressing in their Sunday best. On the beaches of Waikiki, the first surfers were paddling out to catch the early morning waves. It was a day for baseball games between service teams, for writing letters home to loved ones in a distant mainland America, for the simple, unexamined pleasure of a day off. In that tranquil moment, the United States was a nation profoundly at peace, separated from the violent convulsions of the globe by the vast, seemingly impenetrable moats of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The very idea of a direct, large-scale attack on American soil was not just unlikely, it was unthinkable, a fantasy confined to the pages of pulp novels. But 6 miles above the placid surface of the ocean, concealed by a broken layer of clouds, 353 Japanese aircraft were approaching. They were the tip of a spear, launched from an enormous naval task force that had steamed in absolute secrecy for nearly 2 weeks across the hostile North Pacific. In the cockpit of his Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the leader of the aerial armada, looked down upon the unsuspecting fleet, a sight he would later describe as a potent brew for a warrior's soul. For the men on the ships and airfields below, the growing drone of engines on the horizon was, at first, a minor curiosity. They were used to the sounds of training exercises. They assumed it was a routine flight, their own planes returning to base. It was 7:53 a.m. In 2 minutes, their world and the world of the United States would be consumed by fire, shattered by explosions, and transformed forever. The road to this cataclysmic morning was long and paved with a series of escalating confrontations, a slow-motion collision between two empires with irreconcilable ambitions for the future of Asia and the Pacific. On one side was the Empire of Japan, a nation that had, in the space of a few decades, transformed itself from an isolated feudal society into a major industrial and military power. This rapid modernization was coupled with a potent and aggressive ideology, a mix of militant nationalism and a belief in a divine destiny, Hako Ichiu, to bring the 8 crown chords under one roof and unite Asia under Japanese leadership. This ambition was fueled by a desperate and pragmatic need for the natural resources its own crowded islands lacked: oil, rubber, and iron. Since the early 1930s, Japan had been engaged in a brutal and expansionist war to secure these resources, carving out a new empire in Manchuria and mainland China. Their vision was of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, a bloc of Asian nations, led by Japan, supposedly free from Western colonial influence. In reality, it was a euphemism for a ruthless military conquest, one that saw Japanese armies commit horrific atrocities against Chinese civilians and subjugate millions under a brutal occupation. On the other side of the Pacific was the United States, a reluctant but awakening industrial giant. The nation was still reeling from the Great Depression and was deeply committed to a policy of isolationism. Powerful political forces, like the America First Committee, argued passionately that the wars in Europe and Asia were not America's concern and that the country should focus on its own defense and recovery. But President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration saw the growing threat of Axis aggression in both Europe and Asia as an existential danger to American democracy and interests. The United States stood for the open-door policy in China and the freedom of the seas, principles that were in direct opposition to Japan's imperial project. As Japan pushed further into China, and then in September 1940 cemented its alliance with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy by signing the Tripartite Pact, Washington began to apply serious pressure. A series of escalating economic sanctions were imposed, restricting the sale of scrap iron and other strategic materials. The final decisive move came in the summer of 1941. In response to Japan's invasion of French Indochina, a clear threat to British and Dutch colonies in the region, the United States, alongside the British and the Dutch, imposed a total and crippling embargo on oil and gasoline exports to Japan. This was not a mere sanction, it was a checkmate. It was a slow-motion death sentence for the Japanese war machine. Japan imported over 80% of its oil from the United States and another 10% from the Dutch East Indies. Without it, the Imperial Japanese Navy's ships would be unable to sail, its planes unable to fly. The embargo presented Japan's leaders with a stark and unforgiving choice: either abandon 2 decades of imperial conquest, withdraw its armies, and accept a humiliating diplomatic defeat that would likely lead to the collapse of the government, or go to war with the United States to seize the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia by force. In Tokyo, a fierce political battle raged between a moderate faction, led by Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe, who sought a diplomatic solution, and the hardline military faction, led by the stern and uncompromising Minister of War Hideki Tojo. The failure of Konoe's government to secure a diplomatic breakthrough led to his resignation in October 1941. Tojo became Prime Minister, and the point of no return had been passed. For the military leaders who now controlled Japan's destiny, there was no real choice at all. They would go to war. The architect of the plan to initiate that war was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant and complex commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto was under no illusions about the enemy he was about to create. Unlike many of his more jingoistic colleagues, Yamamoto knew America well. He had studied English at Harvard University and served as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. He had seen the vast automobile factories of Detroit and the seemingly endless oil fields of Texas. He understood America's colossal industrial capacity, and he feared it immensely. He famously warned his government that if forced to fight, he could run wild for 6 months or a year, but after that, I have utterly no confidence. He knew that a long, protracted war of attrition against the industrial might of the United States would be unwinnable. Therefore, his strategy was not to win a long war, but to avoid one. He conceived of a plan for a single devastating knockout blow, an attack so shocking and so destructive that it would shatter American morale, cripple its Pacific fleet, and force a demoralized United States to negotiate a peace that would leave Japan, his newly conquered empire in the South Pacific, intact. His target was the heart of American naval power, the only force capable of challenging Japan's ambitions, the U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. The plan, codenamed Operation Z, was a masterpiece of military planning, audacity, and deception, orchestrated by Yamamoto and his brilliant staff officer, Commander Minoru Genda. Genda had studied the successful 1940 British torpedo attack on the Italian fleet at their shallow water harbor in Taranto, and he was convinced a similar but much larger attack could work at Pearl Harbor. The challenges were immense. They would have to sail a massive carrier task force, the Kido Butai, consisting of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and numerous support vessels, across more than 3,500 miles of the notoriously stormy North Pacific. They had to do it in complete secrecy, maintaining absolute radio silence along a desolate route far from normal shipping lanes to avoid detection by any patrol plane or civilian vessel. For weeks, the fleet steamed through heavy seas, its crews unaware of their final destination until the very last moment, a testament to the incredible discipline of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The technical challenges were just as daunting. The waters of Pearl Harbor were shallow, only about 40 feet deep, which would normally cause an airdrop torpedo to dive into the harbor mud before it could arm itself. Japanese engineers worked feverishly to solve this problem, developing special wooden fins that were attached to their Type 91 torpedoes, giving them the necessary aerodynamic lift to run true in the shallow anchorage. For months, Japanese pilots, the elite of their naval air arm, practiced their bombing and torpedo runs against a simulated fleet in the quiet waters of Kagoshima Bay, a location chosen for its geographical similarity to Pearl Harbor. By the time the Kido Butai launched its aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness of December 7th, its pilots were among the most skilled and highly trained naval aviators in the world, honed to a razor's edge for this one specific, all-important mission. While the Japanese fleet sailed in secret, a final, desperate diplomatic dance was playing out in Washington, D.C. The Japanese ambassador, Kichisaburo Nomura, and a special envoy, Saburo Kurusu, were engaged in talks with the American Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. But it was a dialogue of the deaf, a conversation between two sides with fundamentally irreconcilable goals. The United States demanded Japan withdraw its forces from China and Indochina. Japan refused to relinquish its hard-won gains. On November 26th, Hull presented the Japanese envoys with a final, uncompromising proposal. This Hull note essentially restated the American position and was interpreted in Tokyo as a final ultimatum, a rejection of any possible compromise. The decision for war, already made, was now sealed. A long 14-part message was drafted to be sent to the Japanese embassy, a diplomatic document that would officially break off negotiations. The final, 14th part was to be delivered to Secretary Hull at precisely 1 p.m. Washington time on December 7th, just 30 minutes before the bombs were scheduled to begin falling on Pearl Harbor. Japan's leaders hoped in this way to avoid the dishonor of a pure surprise attack. But due to delays in decryption and typing at the chronically understaffed Japanese embassy, the message was not delivered until 2:20 p.m., well after the attack had already begun. Japan's hope for a legal, if not moral, declaration of war had failed. The attack would come, as Franklin Roosevelt would later say, suddenly and deliberately, without warning and without provocation. Even on the very morning of the attack, there were signs, fleeting clues in the signal noise that, if correctly interpreted, might have provided a precious few minutes or even hours of warning, enough to sound a general alert and get men to their battle stations. The first came in the deep darkness before dawn, just before 4 a.m. The minesweeper USS Condor spotted a periscope in the restricted waters just outside the harbor entrance. It was a Japanese midget submarine, one of 5 that had been launched from larger fleet submarines, with the daring mission of sneaking into the harbor and attacking the battleships. The Condor alerted the nearby destroyer USS Ward, which began a patrol. 3 hours later at 6:45 a.m., the Ward's crew, under the command of Lieutenant William Outerbridge on his first day in command, made visual contact with the sub. They attacked immediately, firing their main guns and dropping depth charges. The submarine was sunk. At 6:53 a.m., Outerbridge sent a coded message to the 14th Naval District Headquarters. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area." It was the first shot of the Pacific War, fired by Americans over an hour before the aerial attack began. But the message, passed up a sleepy and skeptical chain of command, was treated with caution rather than alarm. No general alert was sounded. The second and most crucial warning came just after 7 a.m. at a remote, newly established radar station at Opana Point on the northern tip of Oahu. 2 young Army privates, Joseph Lockard and George Elliott, were about to end their training shift. As they prepared to shut down their SCR-270 radar set, a massive blip appeared on the oscilloscope screen. It was a return so large it was literally off the scale, representing what they calculated to be more than 50 aircraft approaching the island from the north. They had never seen anything like it. They knew it was highly unusual. They called the information center at Fort Shafter to report their finding. The duty officer who took the call, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, was on only his second day on the job and had received minimal training. He was aware that a flight of 12 American B-17 bombers was expected to arrive from the mainland that morning. Because these bombers were using a new and experimental radio station on the island as a homing beacon, their exact arrival time and flight path were uncertain. Assuming the massive radar return was that friendly flight, perhaps bunched up more than usual, he made a fateful decision. He told the operators at Opana, "Well, don't worry about it." The two privates, their duty done, ended their watch and went to breakfast. The blip on their screen, the first wave of 183 Japanese attackers, continued its inexorable path towards a completely unsuspecting Pearl Harbor. The final chance to avert disaster had been lost. At 7:55 a.m., the first wave of aircraft, led by Commander Fuchida, swept over the Kulau Mountains and descended upon the harbor. The world of paradise vanished in an instant. Fuchida, seeing the fleet completely unprepared, no barrage balloons, no torpedo nets, no sign of alert, broadcast the triumphant code words back to the Japanese carriers: "Tora, Tora, Tora, Tiger, Tiger, Tiger." It was the signal that they had achieved complete and total surprise. The idyllic Sunday morning was shattered by the high-pitched scream of diving planes, the deafening thunder of explosions, and the staccato rattle of machine gun fire. The primary targets were the 8 American battleships moored along Battleship Row, 2 by 2, off the coast of Ford Island. They were easy, stationary targets, symbols of a naval doctrine that was about to be rendered obsolete in a single morning. Japanese Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers, their specially modified torpedoes working perfectly, skimmed low over the water, a maneuver pilots had practiced to perfection. The USS California, the USS West Virginia, and the USS Oklahoma were all struck by multiple torpedoes within the first few minutes. The Oklahoma, moored outboard of the USS Maryland, was an especially vulnerable target. Hit by as many as 9 torpedoes in its port side, the mighty battleship began to list violently. Water poured in through the gaping holes. Within 12 agonizing minutes, the Oklahoma capsized, its masts digging into the harbor mud, trapping over 400 men inside its dark, suffocating hull. For days afterward, rescue workers would hear the faint, desperate tapping of the men trapped inside. Simultaneously, Aichi Val dive bombers and their escort of Mitsubishi Zero fighters swarmed over the island's airfields at Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows Field. The American aircraft, parked neatly in rows wingtip to wingtip, a measure taken to make them easier to guard against sabotage, were perfect targets. The bombers and fighters strafed and bombed the neat lines of planes on the ground, turning hundreds of American P-40 fighters and B-17 bombers into burning, twisted wrecks before they could even attempt to take off. The American air response, the first line of defense, was effectively neutralized in the first 10 minutes of the attack. The most devastating blow of the morning, the single event that would come to symbolize the entire tragedy of Pearl Harbor, came at 8:10 a.m. A high-altitude bomber flying over the USS Arizona released an armor-piercing bomb that had been specially converted from a 16-inch naval shell. Amidst the chaos and carnage, tales of incredible, almost unimaginable heroism began to emerge. On the heavily damaged USS West Virginia, a mess attendant third class named Doris "Dory" Miller, the ship's heavyweight boxing champion, first helped move his mortally wounded captain to a place of relative safety. Then, with no training in its operation, he manned a .50 caliber Browning anti-aircraft machine gun and began firing at the attacking planes, continuing to fire until his ammunition was exhausted. He would later become the first African American to be awarded the Navy Cross for his bravery. On the USS Nevada, sailors fought desperately through fire and smoke to get their ship underway, hoping to make a run for the open sea. As the battleship, the only one to get moving, steamed down the channel, it became a prime target for the second wave of Japanese bombers, who saw an opportunity to sink it in the narrow channel and block the harbor entrance. The Nevada's crew, realizing the danger, deliberately beached their heavily damaged ship at Hospital Point to avoid this fate, an act of remarkable discipline under fire. At the airfields, a handful of American pilots, including Lieutenants Kenneth Taylor and George Welch, managed to get their P-40 fighters into the air from a small auxiliary field that had been overlooked by the first wave. Flying directly into a swarm of Japanese aircraft, they fought with desperate courage against overwhelming odds, shooting down several enemy planes before the attack was over, becoming the first American air heroes of the Second World War. The second wave of 171 Japanese aircraft arrived around 8:54 a.m., focusing on finishing off damaged ships and attacking other targets around the harbor, such as the naval shipyard. But by now, the element of surprise was gone. The American defenders, though stunned, leaderless, and disorganized, were beginning to fight back. A curtain of anti-aircraft fire, from ships that could still fight and from shore batteries, filled the sky. The resistance was much heavier, and the second wave suffered more losses than the first. A bomb hit the destroyer USS Shore in dry dock, causing a spectacular magazine explosion that sent a mushroom cloud high into the air. By 9:45 a.m., the last of the Japanese planes turned and headed back towards their carriers, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. In less than 2 hours, the pride of the U.S. Pacific Fleet had been transformed into a smoldering, twisted junkyard. 21 American ships were sunk or heavily damaged. 8 battleships, the symbols of American naval might, were now sunk, capsized, or crippled. Over 188 aircraft were destroyed, and another 159 were damaged. The human cost was staggering. 2,403 American service members and civilians were killed, and another 1,178 were wounded. The fires on the oil-slicked water of the harbor burned for days, casting a pall of black smoke over the island of Paradise. As the news of the attack, first in confusing and fragmentary reports, began to spread across the United States via radio, a wave of shock, disbelief, and then white-hot anger swept the nation. In Washington, President Roosevelt was informed of the attack while meeting with an advisor. He remained outwardly calm, but those in the room described his expression as one of terrible grimness. He knew in that moment that the world had changed and that America's long contentious debate over isolationism was over. The following day, December 8, 1941, he stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered one of the most famous and powerful speeches in American history. "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, he began, his voice steady and resolute. "A date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." He described the attack as unprovoked and dastardly, and asked Congress to declare that since that moment, a state of war had existed between the two nations. The declaration passed with overwhelming speed, with only one dissenting vote cast by Representative Jeannette Rankin, a lifelong pacifist who had also voted against America's entry into the First World War. America was at war. From a purely tactical perspective, the attack on Pearl Harbor was one of the most successful surprise military operations in history. The Japanese achieved all their primary objectives with remarkably few losses, only 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. But from a strategic perspective, it was a colossal and catastrophic blunder. In their meticulous planning, the Japanese had made several critical errors of omission. The commander of the carrier task force, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, a cautious and conservative officer, had decided against launching a third wave of attacks. This decision, though debated, proved to be a fatal mistake for Japan. The third wave would have targeted the naval repair yards, the submarine base, and most importantly, the massive fuel storage tanks. The 4.5 million barrels of oil stored at Pearl Harbor were left untouched. Had these been destroyed, the U.S. Navy would have been forced to withdraw its surviving ships to the west coast, effectively ceding the entire Pacific to Japan for a year or more. The intact facilities allowed the Navy to begin salvage and repair operations almost immediately. Furthermore, by a stroke of immense good fortune for the United States, the 3 American aircraft carriers of the Pacific Fleet, the Enterprise, the Lexington, and the Saratoga, were not in the harbor on December 7th. They were out at sea on missions to deliver aircraft to Midway and Wake Island. In the new age of naval warfare that Pearl Harbor itself had just inaugurated, it was the aircraft carrier, not the battleship, that was the decisive weapon. By missing the carriers and the fuel, the Japanese had sunk the battleships of the past, but left the future of the U.S. Navy, its carriers and its logistical capability intact. But the greatest miscalculation of all was a psychological one. Yamamoto and the Japanese leadership believed that the devastating blow at Pearl Harbor would shatter American morale and lead to a negotiated peace. They had fundamentally and fatally misunderstood the American character. The attack did not break the nation's will. It forged it into an unbreakable weapon. It unified a deeply divided country overnight, erasing the bitter lines between isolationists and interventionists. The shock of the attack was replaced by a cold, unified, and terrible resolve. The sleeping giant, as Yamamoto had feared, was now wide awake and filled with an implacable desire for vengeance. The surprise attack that was meant to end a war before it began instead ignited a global conflict that would end 4 years later in the firebombing of Tokyo and the atomic annihilation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, leading to the total and utter destruction of the Empire of Japan. Pearl Harbor was a day of tragedy and infamy, the beginning of a long and bloody chapter in world history, and the moment a peaceful nation was shocked into becoming the most powerful military force the world had ever seen.